Hello, welcome to the Language and Power podcast. We are back for a new series of scintillating and wonderful pieces of insight about text, discourse, language, whatever. Got loads of things lined up for you today. How are you doing, Tom?
I'm grand, thank you, Michael. Nice to be back in the saddle.
It is good, isn't it? I'm actually quite excited. I've got a massive smile on my face. So
I think I should
to be
have
doing
my
this
10-gallon hat and be looking over the prairie looking for oil wells that we can investigate here as I'm in my saddle, to extend the metaphor in a rather dubious direction.
Yes, absolutely. So we're changing the format. Let's just let everybody know we're going for a monthly episode, so that allows us to do things a bit more regularly. So we'll be releasing episodes once a month now. The first, what we're talking about today, we're going back to our favorite topic of the COP conferences, and we're looking at COP29. So this happened last year as we're recording. We're here in June 2025. So we're looking back at the last COP conference, which was held in Azerbaijan. Looking forward to talking about this, Tom.
I am, yes. It's interesting to go back on these topics, and see where they lead us.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we thought when we were thinking about this, we want to talk about COP in Azerbaijan, and I think I was interested in the idea of petrostate. So there's been a few COPs now being held in what petrostate, so states that rely on heavily production of petroleum and oil. And so we thought, let's have a look at that. And the idea of credibility. So I'd noticed in some of the press coverage that the credibility of COP was being brought into question. So that's what we thought we would look at. Some press coverage of this recent COP conference in Azerbaijan, and see how they represented the idea of a petrostate, see how they represented the idea of credibility and so on.
Yeah, and I think as we've been chatting earlier, harks on some very interesting themes that we've covered in past series, which is the extent to which, to achieve stuff through discourse, we need to compromise to some extent. We need to meet people halfway. We need to find common ground. But from another perspective, that can be seen as giving in, giving up your beliefs, your dreams, whatever, and dirtying your hands. And so it's that difficult line between when healthy compromise becomes selling out, which is always an issue in critical things, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really nice topic. There's so many interesting bits and pieces to get into with this topic. And we were looking at thinking then, potentially, that the press influences the way that people see these things. So credibility is brought into question depending on how influential the media outlet is. And setting aside whether or not the mainstream media has the influence that it once had or not, I thought I'd look and see if I could find anything that's tell us which are the most influential media outlets globally. Now, when I was looking at this, I couldn't find very much academic work describing the influential media outlets. Now, that's not to say that there isn't any, but when I was looking for it, I really couldn't find any. So instead, and so I think this is our first interesting issue, is that I found a PR company, and there's a link to this in the description, and I've also done a small blog. So that's another thing that we've changed slightly in this series. I've started writing a few little short written blogs on the website. You can have a look at, slightly anticipating thinking while we're preparing for the episodes, sometimes writing a little bit about what we've recorded so far and so on. But what I did was found this list of influential media outlets, and it lists 50. It's called 50 leading media outlets for news coverage in 2025. So I thought, bingo, this is just what I need. But having looked at that, it's really difficult to pin down what their criteria are. So that's the problem with looking at things that maybe aren't looking to be as robust as we might want them to be. But example, they talk about leading media outlets, then they talk about top news outlets, then they talk about quality, then they talk about audience numbers and credibility again. So what the criteria are for ordering this list is not clear to me. So
no, and it's a nice mixture, isn't it? We've got subjective words in there, which can be argued about, but also, to return to one of your favorite words, some words like influential that there's a little bit of stuff, if we're looking about actors and people involved in that, who's being influenced? Has some of your social participants been missed out here as well? That's just wondering, what do these terms actually mean when people say influential or top?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think as a PR firm, it's clearly thinking about advertisers can get interested in various media outlets. So I think there's something there covering over things. But nonetheless, here are the top 3 news outlets: CNN, BBC, and New York Times. So that's what we went for. But just before we go into those, again, to illustrate the slippery criteria that they're using, CNN is at top of the list because it's, according to them, the most watched news channel in the world, reaching 212 countries and 347 million households. So it seems like we've got cold hard figures for that one. BBC is included as number 2, this time as one of the most respected. So completely different kind of set of categories there. And we don't really know who they've asked to establish their respectedness or not. And then finally, the New York Times is described as the most significant news website in the US. So again, what makes it significant and to whom? Not clear. And clearly a different set of criteria as well. So all 3 are judged on different categories.
It's quite shoddy, isn't it, really? I mean, okay, it's not an academic article and we can't expect that, but it's supposed to be listing these agencies for some reason. And then to use these different terms which loosely define it, it just sort of allows you to include whoever you want, as long as you choose an appropriate adjective there, to say they're respected, they're influential. My granny used to love them when she was doing the ironing or whatever. It's a bit blurred, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we're right to be cynical about this. And you'd expect that if it really is to attract advertisers, you'd think that the advertisers would want something a bit more robust. But yeah.
Actually, I've just realised Granny doing the ironing was a bit gendered, so I'm going to add one. My dad used to cook the family porridge for 8 of us while reading his Guardian with his elbow holding it up when it was broadsheet up on the wall. So it was liked by my dad while making the family porridge to balance the gender representation here.
There you go. And both wonderful homely images, which give us an insight into the Bartlett family household doings. But yeah, thank you. We thought we'd take these anyway. We'll see what we've got in the absence of anything more robust. We thought we'd take these, and we got. Then I looked at what do each of these outlets say about COP29 and petrostate. So I searched their websites for those, and we found 3 articles. So the first one is from CNN. It's called Analysis. Climate leaders were worried Trump would derail talks. They didn't know their host would be the wrecking ball. BBC, climate change. Former oil executive Mukhtar Babayev to lead COP29 talks in Azerbaijan. And finally, from the New York Times, why is a petrostate holding this year's climate talks? Now, they are from different dates, some before, some after. But I think really what we're interested in is, that representation. Are they seeing petrostates as a problem? Are they themselves seeing the fact of these COPs being held in petrostates as damaging the credibility of COP? Or is the coverage itself working towards undermining the credibility of the COP or not? And I'll summarize the articles before we kick into a bit more analysis. The first one, the CNN article, tells us about the COP29 climate talks in Baku, hosted by Azerbaijani President Aliyev. And they've been criticized, it tells us, for prioritizing fossil fuel interests over climate action. It says that in defense of the president of that country defends Azerbaijan's oil and gas industry. And there's been accusations against Western nations coming out of that conference as well, leading to boycotts and calls for a fundamental overhaul in the UN climate process. The BBC takes a slightly different view. It talks about Babayev, the former oil executive and current environment minister of Azerbaijan, will have to lead the COP29 talks in Baku, and his appointment follows Sultan Al Jaber, an oil executive from the United Arab Emirates, who presided over COP28 in Dubai. It does acknowledge that climate campaigners are concerned about the growing influence of the oil industry in climate negotiations, and they are calling for the UN to intervene and remove big polluters from the talks. And then finally, the New York Times article, perhaps the most critical of all, talks about Azerbaijan being a petrostate heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And it's hosting, according to this article, COP29, due to Russia's influence within something called the Eastern European Group. It talks again about Russia blocking other potential hosts, leaving Azerbaijan and Armenia as the final contenders, and that despite Azerbaijan's limited experience in green transition, it is now tasked with hosting the crucial climate talk. So it's a slightly different take on the issue. They're bringing in the influence of Russia on there. Overall, though, really interesting articles, I think.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. One of the things that I'm sure we will talk about in more depth is when we're working out, you're talking about the questioning credibility, but it's a question of whose credibility. Again, it's one of these hidden verbs, believed by who, which is interesting. So you think, what is the story that these papers are trying to make? And there's something you and I discussed before the program is, what angle are they taking on COP? They've all got a very different sort of perspective on what they're trying to say about it. It's not like they're reporting this same event. They're reporting it from a very different angle, and the way they represent it and bring in different people and represent the people involved and what that means in terms of credibility and other things is very dependent on the different goals that they're trying to achieve by this, which isn't necessarily talking about how effective COP is or what's been achieved by COP. There are other aims and goals related to the different newspapers and news agencies here as well that sort of makes it's not like we're comparing apples for apples, really, is it? It's almost different fruit upon the stall that we're comparing.
Yeah, it is. And to try and maybe illustrate that, I also I tried to find some academic work on COP and the presidencies of COP. So this is some work by an academic called Hayley Walker, and found this university publicity site from the university describing the work that she's done. Now, I thought this was interesting because this is public facing. This is not for an academic audience. This is the same sort of press release that I guess the university is hoping the mainstream media will pick up, or some media will pick up on. So it's in form, you'd imagine that it'd be similar. They're not using long academic formats. They're not using convoluted structures and sentences. It's a straightforward, this is what this work expert has said in quite simple terms. And I thought that would be interesting because that's what the press is trying to do. So the difference that we've got here is that it's an academic voice in a kind of format that's mimicking the press. And then we've got the genuine press to see what the differences are. Now, what Hayley Walker says is that her work is looking at the effectiveness of various COP presidencies. And I'll just read a quote from the website. Unlike the Azerbaijani presidency of COP29, looking back, the Emirati presidency was able to deliver an historic outcome with the decision to transition away from fossil fuels. Although it sounds obvious to us, this was the first explicit mention to fossil fuels in a COP decision. They were able to achieve this despite being a petrostate presidency, and maybe even because they were a petrostate presidency. This is something I plan to investigate further on my research. So we've got an interesting kind of take on this, a kind of assessment of which presidency was more successful, arguing that despite both being petrostates, the Emirates were successful, whereas the Azerbaijanis were not successful. So what she's arguing is that it's not the fact that it's a fossil fuel state or a petrostate, but that something else comes into the mix. And what that is, she says, is because the Emirati presidency put in considerable resources. They were able to invest heavily and recruit a lot of experienced people to join their team to help them do just that. They consulted widely and didn't favour one position over another. So what she's saying there is that petrostate is slightly beside the point. The willingness to be neutral and the willingness to invest in good people for your negotiating team is what counts. So, not saying that we agree with that outright, but I think it's an interesting starting point to think about how the press coverage.
Definitely, and I think when she talks about effectiveness, she correlates that very clearly with a historic agreement to move away from fossil fuels, I think is the term, So that's what she means by effectiveness. What Professor Walker means by effectiveness is reaching an agreement, which in a way is what COP is supposed to do. It's a talking shop. Therefore, to reach an agreement is good, and to reach a historic one is very good. So again, what is effectiveness? And therefore, if we're talking about credibility, that's related to what you're trying to achieve as well. And I think this is interesting because she talks about the presidency, but then for her, the presidency means the whole team involved, not the figurehead president. Yeah. So we've got this very interesting thing where you've got the figurehead president, and as we've discussed before with relation to Boris Johnson and others, their speech is often very cosmetic. It's very propagandistic. So you've got this figurehead as the president. You've got the presidency being the whole team that's working behind them to all the stuff we don't see to make sure that runs smoothly. And also the country itself, which isn't necessarily the same as the head of state. So interesting that I think she has here, Hayley Walker, she's focused in on what she means. She means the team, and she means they've reached agreement. And that is one way of looking at COP, that, okay, there's this historic agreement. It wasn't agreed by everybody, and it was agreed by when some people were out in the room, and there were all sorts of astucia about it, all sorts of ructions about it, but at least it went down on paper. What happens afterwards, we can argue about, but there was an agreement. So from her point of view, that's what COP's about. So that was successful. But when other people are looking at it, as we might see, that's not all that COP's about. It's not just about paper talks, it's about lots of other things. Therefore, they might see presidency as meaning the particular head of state or the particular country involved, not the skilled team of negotiators. And so again, we don't even know what the word presidency means now when it's used, and what the actions they're performing are, and what they're supposed to do, and who's responsible. So again, we like muddying the waters, and we're doing a pretty good job of getting them muddier with every sentence.
We are, aren't we? So in some of the work that I've published, I've put things about looking at the social actors in a text and using that to understand how an issue is being conceptualized. And I think that's what we're getting at here. What's the story that's being told? And that story comes from a particular point of view, showing a particular understanding of what's going on. And so, social actors for Hayley Walker, the academic, the Emirati presidency, and the Azerbaijani presidency as a collective team without any named individuals is the category that she's looking at. So that's what we did. I looked at some of the social actors in the media to contrast with that. So if we think of the academic conception of having this collective category of the presidency, I'll go through some of the figures in the articles that we've got before we look at some detail, because I think that's where it's really interesting. But if we look at these three sources, if we start off with the CNN article first. So what I did, to be clear, so I went through each of these articles and identified each instance when a social actor is named or labeled. So a social actor, a person, a human being, a social being who is receiving or doing things that really only human beings can do. And the kinds of things that we're looking at, let me just have a pick out. France can be a social actor if France is described as being a country that demands something. So demand is a human kind of activity. So France is a social actor in that kind of situation. So I've done that. I've gone through each of the articles. And to give a kind of picture of this, the CNN article is 830 words long. It's the longest article that we're looking at. And in those 830 words, there are 87 points at which a social actor is being represented, so labelled. And the kinds of things that we've got here. We've got Aliyev, France, CNN itself, so it's talking about itself in its own article. We've got 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists. We've got Azerbaijan and the Azerbaijanis. We've got climate leaders, the Netherlands, Trump, 300 people, a climate denier. We've got a coalition of groups called Kick Big Polluters Out. So those are the top numerical ones that come out of those 87. So quite different. Not talking about the presidency of the COP, but picking out these individuals and talking about countries as actors. France, the Netherlands. Talking about individuals by name, Trump, Aliyev. Talking about groups of opposing people, 300 people, climate deniers, kick big polluters out, and so on. So quite different. So that's the first article. Second one, I did the same thing, BBC. it's got a different story. This time it talks about Mr. Babayev, who was not the president of Azerbaijan, but is the president of the COP conference. So a different person, but still an individual. And talks about Azerbaijan, talks about Sultan Al-Jaber from the previous conference, and then he goes into kind of individual ones. A minister with vast experience, a former oil executive from authoritarian petrostate. So a different kind of story, different individual, but still individuals, and not this group of the presidency. And then finally, New York Times tells a completely different story again. Overwhelmingly, the most represented social actor is Azerbaijan, an Azerbaijani, and the Azerbaijanis. And then we talk about a petrostate, an autocratic government, an autocratic petrostate, and then Russia, Armenia, and then the author of the article himself, Max Burak. So again, a different story. So we've got individuals, we've got countries, we've got categories of country, we've got different countries being represented, and we've got different people represented. Yeah, what do you think? What do you make of that, Tom?
Oh, great. I mean, I love those sort of statistics like that, or the overview, because they sort of give you a feel for where the text is coming from, and as what we call the field, maybe in linguistics, and they're coming from very different places about how the discussion, what field they're placing it in. I mean, I think very interestingly is the New York Times one, where this is the field of geopolitics. They are really interested in Russia's influence in allowing, we can be honest, Azerbaijan to become the host for COP29. So this is a very different story from, is it okay that a petrochemical guy should be there, or you could take from a different angle? They've taken that story, they've used that same question, but to raise a very geopolitical question about Russia having perhaps undue influence in world politics, which fits very nicely, within US discourses about these sort of things in general. So it's sort of taken the presidency and used that as a prop for a bigger argument, rather than discussing the rights and wrongs of how that might influence the day-to-day workings of COP, which was the focus of. So this is actually polar opposite, I think, to the Hayley Walker's one, where she was trying to avoid all that bustle to say, but behind all that, we can actually get some serious work done, even possibly because they're petrochemical people. So it's very interesting, isn't it? And it's one of the things we've touched on before very much about one of the problems with analysing text to do with COP is, aren't we just looking at the surface stuff, the froth that's there for public consumption? It's not actually where the work's done. And of course, it's really interesting as a discourse, as long as we think about what it's trying to do. And that is maybe, we saw Boris doing his football analogy and all that. That was for public consumption to make him look popular in the UK, to look great. That's very different from thinking about whether COP is successful or not. So I think it's just discourse analysts, we've got to think about what is it we're trying to see. We can't talk about the whole of COP on the basis of Boris Johnson's leader's speech. And we've talked about this before, how difficult it is to see how they interact. But it is still interesting to see how COP is being used by people for their own gains, as well as the immediate agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, the Hayley Walker take on it, looking at it almost in a kind of procedural way, versus these political takes, and almost bringing a personality and making in some cases making a drama out of the personnel, and in some cases, thinking about the big geopolitical picture. And I don't think we can say which is the right, or if there is a right one. They're all elements to it, aren't they?
Yeah. I think that's it.
I think if anything that we want from a discourse analysis is the point that a story is from a point of view, and there are other ways of telling looking at the same thing.
As critical discourse analysis, we're about one point of view. We're critiquing these discourses from a particular perspective. It is not thoroughly objective. It doesn't answer all the questions. We're answering because we've got a certain question we want to answer, which comes from somewhere in it. We might critique them in terms of world power plays. We might critique them in terms of effectiveness in getting things done, whatever. But it's always a partial story, and it's our way of talking about someone's way of talking about something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that gives us a nice sort of overview and intro to these, shall we look at some details on these texts? Shall we start with the CNN one, since that's apparently the most influential news outlet in the world? Should we have a look at that one? The headline is "Climate leaders were worried Trump would derail talks. They didn't know their host would be the wrecking ball." Written by Angela Diwan. And what do we say? That from the moment the US election results rolled in, climate leaders knew Donald Trump would be a blow to the COP29 talks in Baku. What they didn't foresee was the demolition job Azerbaijan's own leader would do from the inside. In what should be one of the most urgent meetings of the year, aimed at slowing a global crisis fast spiraling out of control, the talks have descended into a circus of boycotts, political tirades, fossil fuel celebrations. Its host, Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, has been its spectacular ringmaster. So even just in that introduction, you can see this is making a human story, and it's focusing on the drama. Ringmaster. It's talking about spiraling out of control. It's talking about a circus, that metaphor of the circus. It's got individuals, the drama of Trump's election and the wrecking of these things. So very, emotive and dramatic way of framing this. Quite different to the academic view. Not to say this is one's right or wrong, but yeah.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? But it's so, as you say, so negative. It's making the whole thing look the circus master. Again, we might wonder about a certain level of racism in here. That third world nations, if Azerbaijan counts with one, certain images come up more often than the first world nations might, but they do relate him to Trump. But of course, they're probably trying to make the point that Trump acts like a leader from another country, not a proper US president as well here. So there may be a wee element of racism here that just striking me as I'm reading it, but it certainly focuses on this surface level disorder of people walking out, political tirades. We've seen political tirades in all the COPs we've looked at. Fossil fuel celebrations, okay, they've come on a bit. But a fossil fuel celebration, is that the same as the inclusion of members of the fossil fuel industry to try and make productive agreements that we've seen elsewhere? It's really, this whole picture is a trying. It's a shame because it's really undermining the whole of COP, and maybe that's a worthwhile thing to do. But it seems to be attacking COP at a time when these sort of discussions should be supported. It's not very positive from my point of view. It's very critical, very destructive. And it focuses very much on the man as the president rather than the presidency in Walker's terms, or the country. It's very much talking about him. But interesting, again, what we talked about before about what's happening, the different agendas. Whereas Boris Johnson had a very personal and national agenda to make UK's look really important on the world stage. Aliyev here is using the events to attack France. So he's doing a very different... Within COP, he's making a very obvious geopolitical move to attack France, to join in the movement against the colonial powers, to piggyback on that we saw so effectively done by Mia Muttley from Barbados last time, but sort of put himself in this position. So again, he's playing with the whole idea of COP to make political statements in the same way that we might see at a different level the New York Times as a media also using COP to make political statements, this time against Russia. So again, this is one facet of COP, but I don't think it's the whole story. So focusing on the surface level chaos, it's maybe not, we're not seeing what's been still, all the serious guys might still be doing all the work beneath the surface and ignoring all that.
Yeah, that's a crucial issue, isn't it? We've seen at the time that we've been looking at COP, over the several series that we've done, that we always see a national leader using the COP for their own personal, political, or national gain. They're using it as a stage. It gives them a stage, and they can stand on it and say things that may or may not be even related to the COP, the issue of climate change and COP itself. So that's one level. And as you said, we don't know what's going on. Is that different to what's going on in the actual negotiations behind? Is it a back cloth? How closely are those two things related? That kind of front and backstage part of COP, how influence on that. But then we've got these outside parties, the media here. Now, this is reporting, using words like chaos to talk about these individuals. Well, as we've said, we have seen that this guy is certainly not the first person to use the COP stage. Maybe the CNN disagrees with it more than it has in other instances, but yeah,
but it's about
unique, is it?
credibility for what you're saying and whose credibility. And the point I was making about with the rather outdated term, our third world country, I was sort of trying to capture the perspectives that other people have.
Yeah.
And this is that whole article about the circus there is creating this outdated notion of a third world country. Azerbaijan is a developing country in the modern terminology. But I think there's something in this whole article that resonates, that has this, idea that it's not functioning very well. If we compare it with the coverage last year with Al Jabeer, so he was, again, very similar position in terms of being CEO of the national oil company, but also the president. The critiques were there, but they weren't the same. They weren't this mockery that CNN is doing. And it makes me wonder about that. What is it doing in terms of credibility here, in terms of where is it coming from in the first place? And even seeing Azerbaijan, well, between either of them, the New York Times is saying Azerbaijan could only get this because of Russia's influence. A CNN is saying Azerbaijan is acting like a ringmaster in a circus. There's no credibility to start with coming from these news agencies. They're all automatically discrediting Azerbaijan as a host country, which, forgetting the whole oil connection or the fossil fuel connection, I think is another element that there's where's this credibility coming from the agencies before they even look at the details, and that affects the way you report it. If you don't give these people credibility to start with, you're going to report it in a very different way. You see things differently. You're skewed.
Interesting. As a slightly different angle on this, later on in the article, the CNN article, I'll just read this part out. Increasingly, the annual conferences have welcomed fossil fuel interests into the fold. So this is where it starts talking about fossil fuel interests rather than, it shifts the story from the country of Azerbaijan and its president, just for now. It says this year, more than 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists or industry players had been registered to attend the talks, according to an analysis by a coalition of groups called Kick Big Polluters Out. I think that's really interesting. If that's true, and you've got not just oil and fossil fuel interests in there to genuinely negotiate and discuss how can we transition away from fossil fuels, but if they are truly lobbyists for fossil fuels, then that puts a completely different light on it. And there is a representation of social actor. What those people are, if you call them lobbyists, that's one thing. If they're negotiators, they're another thing. And there'll be some element of truth under one of those. And from an outsider's point of view, I don't know which one it is, but if we take it as read that they are lobbyists, that means that they are trying to promote the interests, not of climate change, not of stopping climate change, but whatever is in the interest of fossil fuel industries, which is more interesting as a story, I think, than the Azerbaijani presidency using the stage and whatever they've started off this. This is the interesting part to me, and it's a real shame that this is a little bit buried.
I think you're right, and I think that's one of the problems we've talked about, isn't it? That analysing that, the extent to which they are lobbyists rather than equal partners in negotiation with their own interests is really interesting. But just to state it as one thing, but then it'd be really fascinating to view and look in detail to see how they're performing these roles, whether they are actually acting as lobbyists or not, and getting down to the nitty gritty of that would be. It's hard for us to do as discourse analysts, but it's also hard for the media. It's also easier for the media just to throw that into paragraph 7 and sort of hide it away under the big story as well. It would be what makes a lobbyist. It's a discourse role to lobby. It's the sort of thing we should be, really looking at to see how the actual negotiations, the ones that are effective. Again, what does effective mean? But to see how they are carried out in real time, and how people's positions change that, and their arguments are more forceful depending on their power. But it's something we have great difficulty getting to ourselves as analysts, but also to the press. maybe doesn't report it in much. I was interested to see that the CNN one has got the subheading, right, the 4-minute read. So this just tells you how much time have you got to invest in this. 4 minutes, right? I can read that on the train on the way to work. It's not promising a huge in-depth analysis, is it? It's saying here's an easily digestible 4-minute, not quite a sound bite, but our sketch in 4 minutes that will tell you what we think you want to know. And anything that's more complicated than the 4 minutes, it hasn't got an audience maybe, and therefore, it has an audience somewhere, but it hasn't got an audience through popular media. So it's almost that the nature of media, and increasingly as we expect more and more sound bites and shorter articles, is to focus on the froth and the circus and not the other stuff.
Yeah, which is a shame, isn't it? If what you're getting out of your social media feed of summarizing the news and what you're getting is it's just a big drama that's undermined the credibility. The perception of COP becomes damaged, doesn't it? Is that COP doing it himself? Is that the UN doing this? The UN should be aware that this is going to happen as well. There's many layers to this, isn't there, to think about what's going on. But should we have a look at the BBC one? Because that's got a slightly different take.
It has.
The BBC changed former oil executive Babayev to lead COP29 talks in Azerbaijan. It says this, and this was before, this is from 5th of January 2024, so it was in advance of the conference itself. But it starts off with this line: for the second year in a row, a minister with vast experience of the oil industry will be in charge of global climate negotiations. Yeah, what do you make of that?
I think it's fascinating. I mean, this is the total opposite to the circus ringmaster, and also far removed from the tainted with oil perspective that we've had of what was, in other articles and about Al Jazeera as well. For that former oil executive, okay, depending on your point of view, this is good or bad, but the BBC's just put it in these terms that you can, how much credibility you give them depends on your perspective there. So that's fair enough. But a minister with vast experience of the oil industry, that to me is positive. I think even if you don't like the oil industry, vast experience doesn't make them worse. This is the BBC presenting this person as an expert, not unreasonably, spent decades working at the National Oil Company. Now that decades again, it's an intensifier to emphasizing this guy's got a lot of experience, he knows what we're doing. So it's presenting a very different perspective of this guy, not as a circus master, not necessarily as someone with dirty commercial interests. Yes, it's oil, but he's expert. So it's really a different way into the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
It does go on later, despite questions over his position, but straight away, despite that, to say something positive that Javier did. So presenting a potentially positive image.
So it certainly leads you towards thinking that experience of the oil industry is a good thing, because it means your imagination goes down that path. He knows he knows how they work, so he'll be able to potentially do a similar thing that Sultan Al Jaber did previous year in getting them to agree that transition away from fossil fuels is a good thing, or something like that. But it's I think there's no doubt. You're right. If oil industry, you'll have your own view of that, but this vast experience is absolutely a positive appraisal, isn't it?
I think so.
Of what he brings to it, and that flows throughout the article. Little is known about Mr. Babayev, who's currently serving as Minister for Ecology and Natural Resources, and so on. So not giving us too much, but where the dissenting voice comes in is in a description of climate campaigners. So it says later on, nevertheless, some climate campaigners are angry at the choice and concerned about the growing role of the oil industry in the talks. And there's a quote: there's a sense of deja vu setting in. We now have a former oil executive from an authoritarian petrostate in charge of the world response to the crisis that fossil fuel firms created. So Alice Harrison from Global Witness. And there's a little bit more to that quote, but that gives you that's where the opposite side of this coin is given.
Yeah, it is in there. The BBC are showing that, but it's not leading, is it? And it's not even terribly convincing where it comes at the end. They give this quote, but they don't. They have a lovely bit afterward that says Azerbaijan has been ruled by President Ilham. He won an election which Western observers said fell short of democratic standards. Again, hint at impropriety, but not much. And then this very strange closing paragraph. Under his rule, Azerbaijan has increased its international profile, the Eurovision Song Contest, the Baku European Games, and COP. What's that adding to the article? I'm not quite sure. Is it just sort of saying that? Is it suggesting that this is just a game for Azerbaijan to increase their standing? Is it saying that Azerbaijan is a country that's coming more and more into the international fold? Or is it just an objective fact that the BBC have put there to end with it? I'm not quite sure what the point of that last paragraph is. It's got me thinking.
Yeah. Let's think about just from social actor. So the social actor there, you've got his rule. So you're harking back to the president. But Azerbaijan is here is represented as a social actor, which is increasing its international profile. Yeah, as though countries have international profiles. I don't know, a pop star or something you might have, or whatever. But it's taking a different view of this whole thing. It's really pulled back from the details of this situation to look at what are the geopolitical relations here.
Yeah,
and almost a kind of fluffy, frothy. So it's about whether you're. It's almost like the social media. How many likes have you got? How many people are talking about you? And so it's, but at the same, it's almost taking away from the seriousness of it. But also at the same time, is it a veiled critique of what Azerbaijan, questioning its motives?
It's different. I find the whole piece quite like that. It can be read in different ways depending on the reader, and I suppose that's a good thing. But it does come across as more favourably disposed, a more positive portrayal of at least himself and Azerbaijan. But it leaves room for that doubt, I think. But it's certainly more positive than this definite circus developing country portrayal in the other press. It does make me wonder what the rules are. I mean, the BBC. Their terrestrial broadcasting has to be objective, whatever that means, and you can certainly argue whether the BBC is objective or not. But I wonder if the language used here is more constrained. I don't know if CNN operates under the same constraints. I'm not sure what the regulations are for that. Certainly, the New York Times doesn't, and the printed press in the UK doesn't. It doesn't need to be objective. But it's interesting that how you can use a lot of objective facts, or that you could argue objective, to still either leave something being interpretable both ways, but still to create certain images, because the individual facts might be objective, but it's the ones you choose to put on paper can certainly make a very different impression. This is an interesting one because it's ambivalent. I think he's an expert. The status of Azerbaijan, and that just left a little bit in the air, but it's very different, and that's fascinating in itself, and is very different from the openly hostile ones from the other press.
Yeah, it is worth remembering. We'll just talk about the New York Times one in a sec, but it is worth remembering that the dates, though, you pointed that out earlier, Tom. The CNN one came in the midst of that conference.
Yes.
Having people having spoken out for express, and this is long in advance, so it is looking at it from a different perspective in time. Yeah, there's an interesting one. So let's have a look at the New York Times one. Headline: Why is the petrostate holding this year's climate talks? Straight to the point. To the point there. And this is the shortest article, I think, no, it's not. It's shorter than the CNN one. But let me just read the first couple of sentence paragraphs. Heading into this month's United Nations-sponsored climate negotiations, the world is contending with rising climate chaos and declining democracy. It won't be lost on any of the attendees in Baku, the Azerbaijani capital, that the talks are being hosted by an autocratic government whose economy relies almost entirely on the fossil fuels, the primary driver of climate change. Okay. What do we make of that one?
As you say, absolutely right in the jugular. It's the whole point of it. It's sort of saying two things, isn't it? It's divided into two halves. One is saying it's entirely down to Russia that they got elected, and the second half is saying that they're an absolute mess of a country because of oil. It's nice. I'm just thinking about that ambiguous or ambivalent paragraph at the end of the BBC where it talked about the Eurovision Song Contest, etc. towards the end of this article, it says the city is home to between 2 million and 3 million people, and its skyline has been remade. So this idea of renovation becoming new, becoming accepted on the world with oil money straight afterwards.
Yeah.
That has allowed the relatively small city to put on large, flashy events, okay, negative, like this one. Each year it hosts a Formula One Grand Prix that sees its downtown city streets transformed into a racetrack. Near the stadium, creaking rigs excrete pools of stagnant oil. So, from the BBC saying it's done the Eurovision Song Contest, well, maybe that's good or bad. This is clearly making the case that oil money is projecting a positive image of this country across the world, while absolutely leading to stagnation and wreaking chimney stacks back at home. It's an accusation of not sports washing, but similar to that, event washing, where we can hold our Formula One, we can have nice songs on Eurovision, but this hides an ugly truth underneath. So it's very negative. This country's totally at the beck and call of Russia and is coming into world prominence, modernizing, but at great cost, and probably hypocrisy is being hinted at as well. So pretty negative article altogether.
It is. One of the things that strikes me, first of all, in this, I'm very much, as you read things, you're put in a position and the words are going through your head and you're inclined to go along with them and agree when you first read with them, which is why we do text analysis, to get ourselves out of that. But one of the things that really strikes me, the question that kind of comes up here, isn't the United States also heavily reliant, this economy, on oil? On all of the economies that we're talking about, the UK economy.
Drill, baby, drill.
European. So what's the difference? Do we say that nobody should? So this idea of a petrostate, if this petrostate is defined as being something that is entirely reliant on fossil fuels for its economy, where do you draw? Where does a state become not entirely reliant?
When does a billionaire become an oligarch? It's the same sort of question, isn't it?
Yeah. If you stop fossil fuels tomorrow in the United States, would that economy not collapse? With the UK, same with the European Union. So you've got that. Now, does that mean that the UK shouldn't have had COP28, or the United States shouldn't? Next time it's in Brazil.
Well, it's interesting because you're talking about that when they talk about the transition away from fossil fuels. One of the reasons given for that, which is a seemingly, it's a difficult but at least positive idea, is that smaller countries will need, and this is China's argument as well, being a massive country, smaller countries need to get the money from fossil fuels to create the infrastructure that will allow them to transition to green energy afterwards. And this is at least a cogent argument saying we can't transition straight away. We need this time to transition away. And that's what some people are arguing for. So some people argue this is pro small countries, the transition in a way. But this is the whole idea, isn't it? This argument against the colonial powers that is harked on here is that you made all your money, you got successful through coal and oil, and now you're telling us to stop doing it because you've reached the top of the heap and you're stopping us get to the top of the heap. So it is in there, and I don't know the answer to that. It's very, very tricky. But even in Scotland, relatively socially progressive, quite a socially progressive country, people who support independence and that are now calling for independence. They often call on independence to be subsidized by oil, and saying that still 50 years on, saying England is stealing all Scotland's oil. Does that make Scotland a petrostate? Would that make independent Scotland a petrostate? Or would it just be, a nice radical country that just needs a bit of oil? It's all a matter of perspective, isn't it?
Yeah. Very interesting. Coming back to the analysis, we've got. I'm just looking at the time. So
no, I'm laughing at that. Bringing us back to the text, always useful. Yeah.
Is that we've got this COP29, and what we've seen is we have got different stories about it. Now, which one's the story that we want to focus on? Is it the bureaucratic process? Is it the psychodrama of leaders attacking other countries and getting on a soapbox? Or is it the kind of more kind of trying to be positive about what might happen if you have oil executives in the room? or is it about geopolitics? All of those are covered across these 3 articles, and the kind of the Hayley Walker take on it as well. Which is more important? Which is how much are they dependent on each other? We can't tell that from a text analysis. That we need something else for that. But it certainly sheds light on the fact that all of these stories are very much coming from different places. You can see that. You can read it in the way they talk about the characters that are in their story, can't you?
Yeah, and I think that relates back to our own positionality as critics, that we always are encouraged to be, is to think about where we're coming from. And whenever we take part in a critical discourse analysis, we've got our own, we are focusing on one aspect of it and saying one thing. It's never the whole thing. And COP is all those things. It isn't just one, all those things that are the circus, positive or negative, the agreements being hammered out, the geopolitical games playing, it serves all those purposes. So, all the critiques are valid, but they're critiquing one aspect that we choose to focus on.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we have run out of time, so we'll have to wrap it up there. We'll put this, all of the links will be on the website. Also, I have started a new Discourse Academy. If you're interested in learning about some of this stuff and these techniques that we've done, you can have a look at that website. I'll put a link in there as well.
See you next time.
Thanks, Tom.